A desperate call for help. The school day ended with Elijah dragging his feet on his way home, every step feeling heavier than usual. The sky was a bleak gray, clouds gathering ominously as if reflecting his worries. His small frame bore the weight of his responsibilities, even as his backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. Today, like most days, he felt the burden of his mother's illness. It had been days since she started feeling unwell, and though she tried to assure him she was fine, Elijah could see the fatigue etched in her face and the way she moved slowly around the apartment. As he neared his home, Elijah clutched a small grocery bag. Inside were a few items he had carefully chosen after school: apples, a loaf of bread, and a few other basics he thought would bring some comfort to his mother. His heart swelled with pride, knowing that even though he was just a kid, he was doing his best to help. But as he approached the building, his chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of unease. Something was wrong. The rusty door to their apartment building was slightly ajar, which was unusual. His mother was always cautious about keeping the door locked, especially in their neighborhood where safety was a constant concern. Elijah's heart pounded as he approached. Taking cautious steps, he paused, glancing down the dimly lit hallway, then pushed the door open wider. Inside, their small, cluttered apartment felt eerily silent. Usually, the air was filled with the sounds of his mother bustling around the kitchen or the faint hum of the television. Today, the silence was suffocating. Elijah's gaze landed on the kitchen, where he saw his mother lying motionless on the floor. The groceries slipped from his fingers, apples rolling across the room, forgotten as panic set in. "Mom." Elijah's voice cracked, filling the silence. He dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was cool, her breathing faint and shallow. Tears blurred his vision, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't break down. Not now. He had to help her. A faint burnt smell caught his attention, and he looked up to see a pot of soup boiling over on the stove, spilling across the burner. With shaky hands, Elijah scrambled to his feet and turned off the heat, barely aware of what he was doing. His focus was on his mother, lying there, unresponsive. He needed to call for help, but where was her phone? Desperation clawed at him as he searched the kitchen. Tossing aside papers and clutter, he remembered it was charging in her bedroom. Elijah dashed into the room, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. His hand shook as he held it to his ear, each ring feeling like an eternity. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm. "It's my mom," Elijah choked out, his words tumbling over each other in panic. She's unconscious, and she's pregnant. I don't know what to do. Please, I need help." There was a pause on the other end, and he could hear the faint sound of typing. "What's your location, sweetie?" 2312 Brownstone Avenue, apartment 204, he said, his voice desperate. "Please, hurry." There was another pause, longer this time, before the operator's voice returned. "You said 2312 Brownstone Avenue on the east side, right?" "Yes, please, we need help. She's not breathing right." His voice cracked, his fear palpable. The operator sighed, and Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. "Honey, I'm going to be honest with you," she said, her tone dismissive. "Calls from that area usually take a while to get to. Our units are spread pretty thin, and we prioritize the most urgent cases. But this is urgent." Elijah's voice trembled, his fear turning to frustration. "She's not breathing right. She's pregnant. Please, I need someone to come now." Silence, heavy and suffocating. Finally, the operator responded with a tone that was almost cold. "In places like that, people need to learn how to handle things themselves. We'll get someone there when we can. Just hold on." The line went dead. Elijah stared at the phone in disbelief, his hand shaking as he slowly lowered it. How could they hang up on him? How could they leave his mother like this? Tears burned in his eyes, but he forced them back. He couldn't afford to cry. He had to act. Taking a deep breath, he knelt beside his mother again, gently placing his hand on her forehead. Her skin was cold, her breathing faint and labored. Panic surged through him, but he fought to remember what he had learned about first aid at school. He had seen CPR demonstrations, but the thought of performing it on his own mother filled him with dread. Yet he couldn't sit by and do nothing. His mother needed him. Muttering words of encouragement to himself, he placed his small hands on her chest, pushing down rhythmically, just like he had been shown in class. "Come on, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You can do this. Please, wake up." As he worked, the weight of his surroundings pressed down on him. The peeling paint on the walls, the broken furniture, the cold silence that filled the room. But he pushed those thoughts away, focusing solely on his mother. With each compression, he willed her to breathe, to come back to him. Just when he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, he heard a faint sound, a distant, growing hum. Was it sirens? Hope surged within him, renewing his determination. He kept going, his mind filled with a single, desperate plea for his mother to be saved. In that moment, Elijah wasn't just a young boy. He was a son fighting for his mother's life, refusing to give up, even when the world around him seemed indifferent. His heart pounded with a fierce determination that surprised even him. He refused to let go, to believe that this was the end. With every beat of his heart, he pushed forward, a small boy in a vast, uncaring world, driven by a love that was boundless and unwavering. As the sirens drew closer, he felt a surge of relief. Help was finally on the way. The community awakens. The faint sound of sirens in the distance ignited a spark of hope in Elijah's chest. He didn't stop the rhythmic CPR. He was performing on his mother, but now his arms ached with renewed determination. The approaching sirens were a lifeline, a sound he clung to in the dim, cold silence of their small apartment. He was tired, so tired, but he couldn't stop now. His mother's life depended on him. "Just hold on, Mom," he whispered between breaths, his voice strained and rough from screaming for help. The sounds outside grew louder, and suddenly, Elijah heard a knock on the door, sharp and insistent. Startled, he stopped and looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow. Was it the paramedics? He scrambled to his feet and ran to the door, swinging it open to find their neighbor, Miss Rosa, standing there. Miss Rosa was a small, elderly woman with a sharp gaze that softened only for those she cared about. Wrapped in a worn floral robe and slippers, her graying hair tucked under a scarf, she exuded the warmth of a protective grandmother. Behind her, other neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sound of sirens and the worried murmurings in the building. "Elijah, what's going on?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and urgency as she pushed past him into the apartment. "I saw the ambulance coming, but they haven't arrived yet. Are you all right, child?" Elijah felt tears sting his eyes again, but he blinked them back. He needed to stay strong. "It's my mom, Miss Rosa. She collapsed, and she's not breathing right." His voice trembled, but he managed to hold it together, gesturing toward the kitchen where his mother lay. Miss Rosa's face tightened as she took in the sight of Elijah's mother on the floor, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. Without missing a beat, she knelt beside her, her hands moving with practiced care as she checked for a pulse, and murmured soothing words under her breath. "She's still with us," she announced, her tone grim but resolute. "We just need to keep her stable until the medics arrive." She looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the hallway where the other neighbors stood clustered, watching with a mixture of fear and concern. "Someone fetch towels and some cold water," she commanded. "And you." She pointed to a younger man with a faded tattoo snaking up his arm. "Get your car ready. If the paramedics don't get here soon, we'll take her ourselves." The man, startled but willing, nodded and dashed down the hallway to get his keys. Elijah watched, stunned, as neighbors he barely knew suddenly sprang into action, transforming their usually quiet, rundown building into a hub of activity. People he'd only exchanged nods with in the past now moved with purpose, gathering supplies, offering words of comfort, and following Miss Rosa's instructions with the urgency of people on a mission. An elderly man named Mr. Patil, who lived on the third floor, appeared at the door with a small, dusty medical kit in his hands. "I have a blood pressure cuff," he said, his voice steady and calm despite the tension in the room. "I used to be a nurse before I retired. Let me help." Miss Rosa nodded, grateful, and Mr. Patil knelt beside her, slipping the cuff onto Elijah's mother's arm with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Elijah felt a wave of relief, watching the neighbors who had come to their aid, their faces etched with quiet determination. He had always felt so alone in this building, surrounded by adults who were busy with their own lives, who rarely spoke to each other except for the occasional polite greeting. But now, in the face of crisis, they were here, coming together to help his mother. He realized with a pang of guilt that he had never thought of them as a community, as people who might be willing to support each other. Yet here they were, each of them willing to lend whatever skills or supplies they had. Miss Rosa dabbed a cloth dipped in cold water on his mother's forehead, muttering encouraging words. "Stay with us, dear," she murmured. "You're strong, and we're all here for you." Elijah watched, his heart swelling with gratitude, as the neighbors worked together with a quiet resolve. It was as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing them, not as strangers, but as a network of support. This was the community his mother had always spoken about, the one that looked out for each other in times of need. Just as Elijah began to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right, he heard the distant wail of sirens growing closer, accompanied by the flashing lights reflecting off the building walls. Rushing to the window, he saw the ambulance turning onto their street, slowly navigating through the narrow lanes lined with parked cars. "They're almost here," he shouted back, his voice tinged with relief and urgency. The paramedics finally arrived, bursting through the door with their medical bags in hand, their faces focused and determined. The room, once filled with neighbors bustling around in makeshift assistance, quieted as the professionals took over. Elijah's heart pounded as he watched them assess his mother, attaching monitors, checking her vitals, and preparing her for transport. Miss Rosa stepped back, her hands shaking slightly but her eyes calm. She placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did good, Elijah," she said softly, her voice full of pride. "You saved her by calling for help and doing what you could. You're stronger than you know." He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you, Miss Rosa. Thank you, everyone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The room was filled with people who had answered his silent cry for help, people who had come together when he needed them most. As the paramedics lifted his mother onto a stretcher, Elijah felt a surge of hope. She was in good hands now, and with his community surrounding him, he realized he wasn't alone. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. There were people willing to share the burden, to help him and his mother in their time of need. The paramedics reassured him with a nod before wheeling his mother out of the apartment. Elijah followed close behind, with Miss Rosa and a few of the neighbors trailing along, offering quiet words of support. Outside, in the cool evening air, Elijah watched as the paramedics carefully loaded his mother into the ambulance. He stood there, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and hope as he glanced back at the neighbors who had gathered around him. They were more than strangers now. They were a family of sorts, bound not by blood, but by a shared commitment to look out for each other. As the ambulance doors closed, one of the paramedics placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Your mom is going to get the help she needs," he said. "She's lucky to have a son like you, and a community that cares." Elijah nodded, his chest tightening with a swell of emotion. He felt Miss Rosa's hand slip into his, giving him a comforting squeeze as they watched the ambulance pull away. In that moment, he knew that the bonds they had forged today were just the beginning. Together, they would fight for each other, support each other, and prove that even in the face of hardship, they were never truly alone. As the ambulance faded into the distance, Elijah turned to the neighbors who had come to his aid, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Miss Rosa smiled, pulling him into a gentle hug. "We'll always be here for you, Elijah," she murmured. "That's what community is for. A mother's silent strength." Elijah sat in the waiting area of the hospital, his small frame sinking into the oversized chair. His heart pounded, each beat echoing the uncertainty that filled him. He was surrounded by strangers in various states of worry, their faces mirroring the anxiety he felt but didn't have words for. Miss Rosa sat beside him, her presence steady and calming, a quiet pillar in the midst of his swirling thoughts. The rest of the neighbors had gone home, their comforting words still lingering with him, reminding him he wasn't alone. Elijah tried to piece together what had happened, but the night felt like a blurry montage of fear, determination, and the unwavering support of the community. Just hours ago, he had been kneeling on the cold, cracked linoleum floor of their apartment, his hands pressing rhythmically on his mother's chest as he begged her to wake up. Now, here he was, in a sterile waiting room, his mind racing with questions and fears. Miss Rosa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the present. "They'll take good care of her, Elijah. Your mom's a strong woman. She's been through a lot. She's going to pull through this too." Her voice was firm, filled with a conviction Elijah wanted so desperately to believe in. He looked up at Miss Rosa, her lined face softening as she met his gaze. "She always told me she was strong because she had to be," he murmured. "She said it was just her and me against the world." His voice wavered as he spoke, the truth of his words sinking in deeper than they ever had before. Miss Rosa's eyes grew misty, and she squeezed his shoulder a bit tighter. "And she's right. But tonight, you showed her that she doesn't have to carry that weight alone." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You saved her, Elijah. When no one else was there, you were. You did that." Elijah nodded slowly, but inside, he felt an overwhelming weight. The responsibility he had shouldered felt far too heavy for someone his age. He had learned CPR in health class, had seen the demonstrations, but he had never imagined he'd have to use it, let alone on his own mother. He had acted on instinct, a survival response rooted in love. But now, in the quiet of the waiting room, he felt the full impact of that moment crashing down on him. The door to the waiting room swung open, and a nurse stepped inside, her face a mask of professionalism mixed with kindness. She looked around, her eyes landing on Elijah and Miss Rosa, family of Ms. Daniels. Elijah's head shot up, his heart thudding as he stood, Miss Rosa rising beside him. "I'm her son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse nodded and gestured for him to follow. "The doctor would like to speak with you." Elijah swallowed hard, his palms damp with nerves, but Miss Rosa took his hand, giving him a reassuring squeeze as they followed the nurse through a maze of sterile hallways, the scent of antiseptic filling the air. They arrived at a small consultation room, where a doctor waited, his face calm but serious. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez, his gaze kind as he looked down at Elijah. "Your mom is stable now, Elijah. You did a good job keeping her breathing until help arrived." He paused, giving Elijah a moment to process his words. The fainting spell she experienced was caused by low blood sugar and dehydration. Given her pregnancy, these symptoms can be dangerous if left untreated. Elijah nodded, absorbing the information but still feeling a sense of dread. "But she'll be okay, right?" Dr. Ramirez smiled, a small, reassuring gesture. "Yes, with proper care. She'll be just fine. We're going to monitor her for a bit longer, but she's in good hands now. You've done more for her than you realize, Elijah." Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with a lingering sadness. This wasn't the first time his mother had overextended herself. She was always running herself ragged, juggling 2 jobs, managing the household, and taking care of him. She hardly ever took a moment for herself, and now, with a baby on the way, things were only going to get harder. As if sensing his thoughts, Miss Rosa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You and your mom are fighters, Elijah. But maybe it's time for her to have a bit of help." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of a promise. Elijah looked up at her, the worry in his eyes plain as day. "I don't know if she'd ever let anyone help, Miss Rosa. She always says we're all we have." Miss Rosa gave him a sad smile. "Maybe she thinks that because she hasn't seen how much we care." Tonight, that changed. She saw how the neighbors came together for her, how you stepped up when she needed you. "That means something, Elijah. It's a reminder that no one has to do it all alone." Dr. Ramirez spoke up, his tone warm. "If it's all right with you, Elijah, you can see your mother for a few minutes. She's awake, but a bit groggy." Elijah's heart leaped at the thought of seeing her, and he nodded eagerly. The nurse led him down another hallway to his mother's room, where she lay on a hospital bed, pale but awake. Her eyes brightened as she saw him, a soft smile spreading across her face. "Hey, baby," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. Elijah walked over, his own face breaking into a smile as he grasped her hand. "Mom, you scared me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I thought I was going to lose you." She squeezed his hand gently, her gaze softening. "I'm sorry, Eli. I didn't mean to scare you. I pushed myself too hard. I thought I could handle everything on my own." He felt a surge of determination rise within him, and he looked at her with a newfound strength. "You don't have to do it alone, Mom. The neighbors came. Miss Rosa, Mr. Patel, even people I didn't know. They were all there for you, and I'll always be here too. We're not alone." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at her son, seeing him not just as her little boy, but as someone who had grown, who had faced a storm and come out the other side. She reached up, brushing a hand through his hair. "You've grown so much, Eli. I'm so proud of you." He bit his lip, blinking back his own tears as he felt the warmth of her hand on his cheek. "I'll be strong for you, Mom. We'll be okay. But promise me you'll take care of yourself too." She nodded, her gaze steady as she met his. "I promise, Eli." At that moment, Elijah felt something shift within him, a quiet resilience settling in his heart. He realized that strength didn't mean carrying every burden alone. It meant knowing when to lean on others, when to accept help, and when to let love guide you through the darkest of nights. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, both of them finding comfort in the silent bond they shared. They were fighters, but they didn't have to fight alone. With the support of their community and the strength they drew from each other, Elijah knew they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. And in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the beeping machines and the soft hum of life moving forward, Elijah found something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of hope that, no matter how difficult life became, they would always have each other. The weight of a promise. As the initial relief of seeing his mother safe and awake washed over him, Elijah found himself overwhelmed by a new sense of responsibility. The reality of their lives, the constant struggle, the endless balancing act his mother endured, pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something more to help her. The following day, Elijah and his mom returned home, but things felt different. There was a fragility in the air, a lingering reminder of how close they had come to a devastating loss. His mother moved slowly, fatigue etched on her face, but she tried to keep a brave smile for him. Elijah, noticing every weary movement and every quiet sigh, felt his resolve harden. As his mother rested on the couch, Miss Rosa visited, bringing a bowl of homemade soup and a basket of bread. Elijah thanked her, helping her into the apartment with the warm food that filled the space with a comforting aroma. "Elijah," Miss Rosa said softly, once they were alone in the small kitchen, "I've been thinking. Maybe your mom needs someone to help her for a while. A few hours a day at least. And I could check in, make sure she's taking it easy. She gave Elijah a gentle, knowing smile. I don't mean to meddle, but I know what it's like to try to do it all on your own. Elijah nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. She won't accept help. She says she doesn't want to be a burden. He sighed, a mixture of frustration and sadness filling his chest. She's always been like that. Strong. She thinks she has to do everything alone. Miss Rosa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Strong doesn't mean carrying everything by yourself, Elijah. Your mother is a wonderful woman, but she's spent so long being strong that she's forgotten that accepting help is its own kind of strength. And maybe, just maybe, she'll see it differently now. After everything that's happened, she might realize that she can let us in. After Miss Rosa left, Elijah sat with his mother as she rested. She leaned back, her eyes closed, a softness in her face that he hadn't seen in a long time. She looked peaceful, but tired in a way that went beyond just the need for sleep. It was as though years of struggle had settled into her bones. "Mom," he said, breaking the silence, "we need to talk about something." She opened her eyes, looking at him with a hint of curiosity. "What's on your mind, honey?" Elijah hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Rosa came by, and she offered to help out, just until you're feeling stronger." His mother's face tightened. "Elijah, you know I don't want to trouble anyone. We're doing just fine." "Mom," he said gently, "we almost lost you." His voice cracked, and he took a shaky breath. "You don't have to do everything alone. There are people who care about us, who care about you. It's not just Miss Rosa. When you were in the hospital, everyone came. Mr. Patel, even people I didn't know. They all came to help." She looked at him, her face softening as she reached out to hold his hand. "I know, baby. I know people care, but—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I just never want you to feel like I'm not doing everything I can for us. I've always been the one who holds things together." Elijah squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of courage. "You hold things together, but you don't have to do it alone. That doesn't make you any less strong. I don't think anyone could go through what you have. But maybe letting people in is part of being strong too." She looked away, blinking back tears. "You're so grown up, Eli. I don't know when that happened, but you're right." She gave him a sad smile. "Maybe it's time for me to accept a little help." Elijah felt a wave of relief and hope. He knew it was only the beginning, but it felt like a victory, a small but meaningful step toward a different kind of life for both of them. That evening, as he watched her eat Miss Rosa's soup and smile in genuine appreciation, he saw a change. She was starting to let go, to trust that she didn't have to carry everything alone. The next day, with his mother's reluctant approval, Miss Rosa and a few neighbors arranged a rotating schedule to check in on her. It wasn't a lot, just small gestures. A hot meal, a helping hand, a friendly conversation, but it made a world of difference. His mother slowly grew stronger, and with that strength came a lightness that Elijah hadn't seen in years. But as the days passed, Elijah found himself thinking about the 911 call that night, the way his desperate plea had been dismissed. The memory lingered in the back of his mind, festering like an open wound. He couldn't forget the operator's dismissive tone, the way she had brushed off his panic as though it were an inconvenience. One afternoon, Elijah decided he needed to speak with someone about it. Miss Rosa listened patiently as he recounted the details, her face darkening as he described how the operator had dismissed him. "That's not right," Miss Rosa said firmly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. "You did everything you could, Elijah. That operator should have treated your call with the urgency it deserved. It's not just about you. It's about anyone who might need help and not get it because someone decides they're not worth the effort." Elijah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I don't want anyone else to feel like that. It was awful. I don't want someone else's mom to be ignored." Miss Rosa patted his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You've got a good heart, Elijah. Maybe you can use what happened to help others, to make sure things like this don't happen again." The next day, Elijah gathered his thoughts and wrote a letter to the city's emergency services department. He poured his heart into the words, recounting the pain and fear he had felt when his call was disregarded. He described the long moments of helplessness, the strength he had found, and the support of his neighbors. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change. He wanted to make sure that no one else had to face what he had endured. A week passed, and then one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Elijah. It was from the Director of Emergency Services, a formal response to his heartfelt letter. Elijah's hands trembled as he opened it, his heart racing as he read the words. The letter expressed deep regret for his experience and promised an internal investigation into the incident. The director thanked him for his courage and for taking the time to write about his experience. They had assured him that steps would be taken to review their procedures and training to ensure that all calls were treated with respect and urgency. Elijah felt a surge of pride as he shared the letter with his mom and Miss Rosa. His mother hugged him, tears in her eyes as she whispered, "You're making a difference, Eli. You're making sure no one else goes through what we did." Miss Rosa beamed with pride. "You're one brave boy, Elijah. And you're right. A community stands by its people. You reminded them of that. And you showed them what a difference they can make." In that moment, Elijah felt a strength he hadn't known before. He had faced fear, fought for his mother, and challenged the very system that had dismissed him. He realized that, just as Miss Rosa had said, strength wasn't about carrying everything alone. It was about knowing when to ask for help, when to trust others, and when to stand up for what was right. As Elijah looked around at his mother and Miss Rosa, at the small but powerful community that had rallied around them, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving. He was part of something larger, a network of people who looked out for each other, who believed in the power of love and support, and he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, not alone, but with a community that stood with him every step of the way. A community united. The days that followed brought a new sense of purpose to Elijah's life. He found himself walking home from school with a lighter heart, each step infused with a newfound confidence. He no longer felt like a kid carrying the weight of the world alone. He felt like a young man with a voice, one that people were willing to listen to. His letter to the emergency services had sparked a conversation, one that he realized might lead to real change. He was still only a boy, but he had learned that standing up for what's right could ripple out, affecting more lives than he'd ever imagined. At home, his mother was gradually regaining her strength. Miss Rosa and the neighbors kept checking in, often arriving with warm meals or helping with small chores around the apartment. Their kindness allowed his mother to focus on healing rather than shouldering everything herself. Elijah could see a difference in her, too. She looked less weighed down, and her smile was becoming a more frequent sight. It was as though a bit of the heaviness she'd carried for years was finally lifting. One afternoon, Miss Rosa organized a gathering in the small park near their building. She called it a community check-in, a chance for neighbors to come together and share their struggles, stories, and hopes. It was a small, impromptu event, yet by the time Elijah and his mother arrived, the park was filled with people. He saw faces he knew, Mr. Patel, the tattooed man from down the hall, and even kids from school he'd only seen in passing. Some had brought food, others chairs, and everyone had brought a spirit of togetherness that was palpable. Elijah watched as his mother moved through the crowd, greeting people with a warmth that seemed to grow with each interaction. It was heartening to see her surrounded by so much support. She looked alive in a way he hadn't seen before, as if she'd found her place within the web of neighbors who had come to mean so much to both of them. Miss Rosa stood on a small crate in the center of the gathering and addressed everyone with a voice that commanded attention. "We're here today because we care about each other. When one of us is in need, the rest of us step up. That's what community means. It's not just living next door to each other. It's knowing we're family, even if we aren't related." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading like a warm breeze. "We know life here isn't always easy," she continued, her voice softening. "But that's why we need each other. Sometimes, a small act of kindness can be the difference between feeling lost and knowing you're supported. I want to thank everyone who came to help Elijah's family, and everyone who brought a piece of their heart to this community." As she spoke, Elijah felt a swell of gratitude for Miss Rosa. Her words made him realize just how much people like her could impact their world. She didn't have wealth or status, but she had a fierce love for her neighbors and an unyielding belief in the strength they all shared. When Miss Rosa finished, she gestured to Elijah, who froze for a moment as all eyes turned to him. She waved him forward with a warm smile. He felt his heart pound in his chest, but he took a deep breath and stepped onto the crate beside her. Standing in front of his neighbors, he felt both small and powerful, but he knew he had something to say. "I just want to thank all of you," he began, his voice shaky but growing steadier with each word. "When my mom got sick, I was really scared. I thought we were alone. But that night, all of you showed me that we're not. You came to help when we needed you the most, and you reminded me that we're stronger together." The crowd watched him with encouraging smiles, nodding as he spoke. He looked down at his mom, who was watching him with tears in her eyes, pride radiating from her face. "I wrote a letter to the emergency services about what happened that night," he continued, glancing around the crowd, "about how they treated our call like it didn't matter. They've promised to look into it, but I know it's not just up to them. It's up to all of us to make sure we don't let each other feel forgotten or ignored." Miss Rosa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Elijah, you're a remarkable young man. We're all so proud of you. This community has needed someone to speak up, and you've done that with more courage than most adults." There was a moment of silence, and then someone in the crowd called out, "Here, here." Applause filled the air, and Elijah felt a warmth unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His heart was full, not only because of the gratitude he felt, but because he realized he wasn't just part of this community, he was helping to shape it. After the gathering, people lingered, chatting and laughing together. The sense of unity was palpable, a shared warmth that transcended the hardships they all faced. Elijah saw the tattooed man approach his mother, offering to fix the broken handle on their apartment door, while Mr. Pottle handed her a small envelope, saying it was just a little something to help with expenses. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light over the park, Elijah wandered over to Miss Rosa, who was watching the crowd with a contented smile. She looked over at him and said, "You know, Elijah, sometimes change starts with one small step, one brave voice." Elijah nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I never thought I could make a difference." Miss Rosa chuckled softly. "Well, you've already made a difference to everyone here, and who knows, maybe your letter will change the way people in power see communities like ours. But remember, true change starts right here with us." The two of them watched as the last few neighbors began to disperse, sharing hugs and goodbyes. Elijah realized that he had never felt so connected, so at home, in this place he'd always seen as filled with struggle and hardship. Tonight, it felt like a haven, a sanctuary of support. Walking back to the apartment with his mother, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. As they stepped through the door, his mother turned to him with a smile. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah," she said, wrapping her arms around him. "You're becoming someone this community can look up to, someone who isn't afraid to stand up for what's right. I'm so grateful you're my son." He hugged her back, holding onto her tightly. In that moment, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would continue to fight for her, for their community, and for a world where everyone was seen and valued. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about all the people he'd seen at the gathering, the smiles and encouragement, the promises of help. He had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like his voice didn't matter. But now he knew the truth. His voice did matter, and he had a responsibility to use it, not just for himself, but for everyone who looked to him as a symbol of hope and resilience. Elijah closed his eyes, a sense of purpose settling over him. He had found his strength, not in isolation, but in unity, in the powerful, unbreakable bond of community. And with that knowledge, he knew he could face whatever came next, not alone, but with the strength of everyone who stood beside him. The power of a voice. A week after the community gathering, Elijah received a letter from the emergency services office. His heart pounded as he opened it, eager to see if his words had sparked any real change. The letter was printed on official letterhead, the emblem stamped in dark ink at the top. He read each line slowly, feeling a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The letter began with an apology, acknowledging the distress caused by the operator's dismissal of his call. It mentioned that an internal review had been conducted, revealing serious flaws in the response system, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. The letter continued, "We are committed to making changes to ensure that every call is treated with the urgency it deserves, regardless of location. Effective immediately, we are implementing new training and revising our protocols to prevent incidents like this in the future." Elijah's eyes widened as he continued reading. Not only had they reviewed the response protocols, but they were also offering him a meeting with the Director of Emergency Services to discuss his experiences and any further suggestions he might have. He held the letter tightly, a sense of pride welling up within him. His voice had mattered. His words had made a difference. He could feel the weight of his actions, a ripple effect spreading out from his single letter to impact others he'd never meet. But he knew this change wasn't only for him. It was for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored in times of crisis. When Elijah told his mother about the letter, her eyes filled with pride, and she hugged him tightly. "You've done something incredible, Elijah. You've reminded them that every person, every life, deserves respect and attention." The meeting with the emergency services director was set for the following week, but Elijah wasn't going alone. When he mentioned it to Miss Rosa, she insisted on accompanying him, as did Mr. Patel and the tattooed neighbor, whose name he'd learned was Tyrone. They wanted to support him, not only because he was a young boy, but because he was part of their community. A community they now realized had a voice worth fighting for. On the day of the meeting, Elijah wore his best clothes, a pressed shirt, and clean slacks his mother had managed to borrow from a friend. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he felt more than just prepared. He felt empowered. This was his moment, a chance to make sure that the voices of his community were not only heard but respected. When they arrived at the emergency services office, the director greeted them warmly, leading them into a conference room where other high-ranking officials were seated. Elijah felt a flicker of nerves as he looked around at the rows of polished tables and chairs, the official-looking people with their pens poised and notebooks open. But he drew strength from his neighbor's presence beside him and took a deep breath. The director opened the meeting by apologizing to Elijah directly. "Elijah, we're here because of you. We failed to respond to your call for help the way we should have, and for that, we're truly sorry. We're making changes to ensure that no one else has to experience what you and your mother went through." Elijah nodded, gathering his courage to speak. "Thank you for listening," he began. "But it's not just about what happened to my mom. It's about all the times people in our neighborhood have been ignored. Just because we don't live in fancy houses or have a lot of money doesn't mean our lives aren't valuable." His words hung in the air, a profound silence settling over the room. He felt Tyrone's hand on his shoulder, a silent show of support. Elijah continued, explaining how his community had come together to support him and his mother when the emergency services had failed them. He shared the story of how people with little to spare had given everything they had to help, and how he believed that everyone deserved to feel that level of care and compassion, especially in moments of crisis. As he spoke, he saw nods from the officials around the table, and he felt a sense of hope take root in his heart. By the end of the meeting, the director assured Elijah that new policies would be implemented and that he would receive updates on the progress. They thanked him for his bravery and invited him to return any time he had further input, making it clear that his perspective was not only welcomed but valued. When they left the meeting, Elijah felt a renewed sense of pride, a feeling that had been foreign to him until recently. It was Miss Rosa who wrapped him in a tight hug first, whispering, "You did it, Elijah. You made them see us." The weeks that followed were filled with even more changes in the community. A new sense of unity had blossomed, with neighbors checking in on each other more frequently and offering help when needed. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, a role he'd never expected but embraced wholeheartedly. People began referring to him as the young hero of the building, and his mother couldn't hide her pride every time she heard it. One evening, as he sat with his mother and Miss Rosa on the stoop of their building, a small group of children approached him, their eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. "Is it true, Elijah?" one of the kids asked, his voice filled with awe. "Did you really make the police and the ambulance people listen to you?" Elijah smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I guess I did. But it wasn't just me. It was everyone here, all of us coming together. That's what really made them listen." The kids listened, captivated, and Elijah could see in their eyes the spark of inspiration, a belief that maybe they, too, could make a difference one day. It filled him with a quiet pride to know he was helping to create a sense of hope in his community, a feeling that had been scarce for too long. Over time, he continued to advocate for his community, organizing small gatherings with Miss Rosa's help to discuss ways to improve their building and neighborhood. Together, they'd managed to secure basic repairs, cleaner facilities, and even began a community watch group, ensuring that everyone felt safer and more connected. The day his mother fully recovered, Elijah knew he had helped create a lasting legacy. His mother hugged him tightly, her voice filled with emotion as she said, "Elijah, you're not just my son, you're a hero to all of us." In that moment, Elijah understood that he had not only changed his own life and his mother's, but had become a symbol of resilience and hope for everyone around him. The journey hadn't been easy, but he knew it was far from over. There were still battles to fight, voices to lift, and lives to touch. As he looked around at the faces of his friends, family, and neighbors, he realized he would never feel alone again. He was part of something greater, a force that no neglect or indifference could silence. Elijah had discovered his strength, his purpose, and most importantly, his place in a world he was determined to make better for everyone around him.